Why does she cost US this much? The new VP scoffed as he hurriedly rewrote my position without even telling the board. I had very clearly warned them about a particular, vital clause in my contract, but legal brushed it off completely. By the next morning, the company had lost $1.5 billion. Imagine pouring your entire life, 14 years of sweat, expertise, and quiet dedication, into building something absolutely critical for a multi-billion-dollar company. Now, picture a hotshot new VP, barely old enough to rent a car, pointing at your compensation package on a screen for the entire executive board to see, calling it bloated legacy spending. What would you do? Because what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that his little presentation was about to trigger a contractual bomb that would cost them not thousands, not millions, but billions. Let me take you back 6 months. My name is Tinsley Drake, and back then, I was the Senior Director of Risk Architecture and Regulatory Compliance at Crest Global Solutions. Sounds dull, right? Most people's eyes glaze over when I explain it. But that title, that work, was the invisible shield protecting a $6.8 billion company from catastrophic federal enforcement actions. I'm 43, Columbia-educated, NYU law. 6 years at the SEC, specializing in the very frameworks that prevent financial services firms from imploding. Crest poached me in 2011, right when Dodd-Frank hit, desperate for someone who could navigate that regulatory maze. My husband, Jacob, is a structural engineer. He builds bridges. Our son, Logan, is at Cornell. Between his tuition, our Brooklyn brownstone, and the comfortable life we'd built, my $685,000 annual package wasn't some extravagant indulgence. It was appropriate compensation for someone who maintained the complex, invisible infrastructure keeping a multi-billion-dollar company compliant with 23 different regulatory bodies across federal, state, and international jurisdictions. My work wasn't glamorous. No headlines, no big deals. I designed and maintained the intricate compliance architecture that allowed everything else to function. SEC, FINRA, state banking commissioners, international data privacy, anti-money laundering, each with its own rules, reporting, and enforcement philosophies. I knew which specific examiner at which agency cared about which compliance markers. I knew which regulations had teeth and which were just performative. I built systems so airtight that when auditors showed up unannounced, every document was organized, cross-referenced, and ready. That knowledge isn't a manual, it's 19 years of pattern recognition, understanding how enforcement priorities shift, and cultivating relationships with the real decision-makers. Crest's clients, pension funds, endowments, sovereign wealth funds, they managed $1.2 trillion. They bought our services, but what they really bought was our compliance reputation, a reputation built almost entirely on my frameworks, my relationships, my institutional knowledge. Then Carter Wells arrived last October. He was Lydia Vance's hand-picked hire. Lydia, our new CEO, came from Silicon Valley Tech. She spoke fluently about operational efficiency and scalable systems but clearly had no real grasp of financial regulatory complexity. Carter, 34, Wharton MBA, McKinsey stint, full of that supreme confidence that comes from dismantling organizations without ever having built anything lasting. I first saw him at an all-hands meeting. Impeccably tailored, radiating that fresh-faced, never-failed confidence. His presentation deck promised operational excellence through strategic transformation. He'd spent 45 days conducting an audit. What I've discovered, he announced, represents significant opportunity for structural improvement and cost rationalization. He talked about automation, AI. His slides compared our compliance expenditures to benchmarks, companies that either had faced massive penalties recently or hadn't been around long enough to truly encounter scrutiny. We are substantially overstaffed in certain legacy functions, he said, scanning the room with practiced concern. Not because anyone had underperformed, he insisted, but because our operational approach hasn't evolved. Afterward, he intercepted me by the elevators. Tinsley, correct? His smile didn't reach his eyes. I'd like to schedule time for a detailed discussion about your department. Bring comprehensive documentation. I want to understand what can be automated and what genuinely requires human judgment. That should have been my first clear warning. But I'd survived 4 acquisitions, 6 CEOs, countless reorganizations. I knew how to document value. I wasn't concerned. In retrospect, that was so naive. Our meeting was in his new, minimalist office. He gestured to a chair. Walk me through why regulatory compliance requires this level of investment. For 50 minutes, I patiently explained the landscape, the jurisdictional complexity, managing 37 agency contacts, the customized reporting, the audit prep that kept us violation-free for 11 years. Carter nodded, taking notes, asking questions that started thoughtful but quickly revealed his profound misunderstanding. Couldn't the majority of this be handled through RegTech platforms? AI-driven solutions at a fraction of the cost? Those platforms are tools, I explained, useful for data aggregation. But compliance isn't just checking boxes. It requires judgment in gray areas, relationship management when issues arise, institutional knowledge about shifting enforcement priorities. I gave him a concrete example, an anomaly with the Ohio State Teachers' Retirement System, a pension fund client. An automated system would have flagged it as compliant. But my experience told me something was off. I called their chief compliance officer, walked through my analysis, and we uncovered a vendor integration problem that would have become a major violation within 90 days. They renewed for 4 years, I concluded. Upgraded their service tier. That account generates $18 million annually. More importantly, it strengthened our reputation, leading to 3 additional client acquisitions. Carter just made a note. Interesting case study, but is that approach sustainable as we scale operations? That word, sustainable, became his favorite weapon. Every conversation, every email, every hallway interaction circled back to whether my role, my team, my entire approach was sustainable for modern efficiency. Standards. I started documenting everything meticulously, every question, every suggestion, every hint that my position was being evaluated not for performance, but for cost reduction. In mid-November, I had lunch with Emily Chandler, an old colleague. She'd left a competitor after their compliance director was terminated during restructuring. "Let me guess the pattern," Emily said, after I described Carter. New executive, consulting background, thinks compliance is a software subscription instead of expertise. Exactly, I replied. Tinsley, they replaced our director with a less experienced manager and a RegTech platform for $200,000. Guess what happened last month? Tell me. FINRA showed up for a routine spot check. 23 documentation gaps, 9 reporting inconsistencies, 3 potential material violations. We're facing 8-figure penalties. We've lost 3 major institutional clients who cited compliance concerns. Our director warned them, documented every risk in her exit interview. They didn't care because they saved $450,000 on her salary. Now they're facing $30 million in fines and another $60 million in lost revenue. I drove back to the office, the conversation echoing in my head. That night, I pulled my employment contract from our home office file cabinet. Article 12, Section 7, Subsection D practically leaped off the page. This language had been negotiated by my attorney, Claire Holloway, during the Vanguard acquisition 4 years ago. Vanguard's due diligence had identified significant key person risk in my role. This clause was their protective mechanism. If my institutional knowledge disappeared suddenly, there would be financial consequences substantial enough to discourage careless management decisions. The clause specified that if my position was eliminated or materially restructured without specific protocols, a 240-day transition period, formal board approval, documented risk mitigation, client notification, it would trigger automatic acceleration of all my deferred compensation, invested equity grants, and performance bonuses accumulated over my entire 14-year tenure. More significantly, it included penalty provisions if my departure caused client contract disruptions. Several of our largest institutional clients had continuity clauses requiring notification and approval of any changes to senior compliance personnel. These weren't suggestions, they were contractual rights with termination provisions. I'd warned Vanguard about these complexities during the acquisition. They'd built these protections precisely because their financial analysis showed what would happen if my specific institutional knowledge vanished without proper planning. But that was 4 years ago. New leadership, new priorities, new managers who apparently hadn't bothered reviewing the documentation. On November 18, I drafted a formal memorandum. Subject: Compliance Role Restructuring, Contractual Considerations and Risk Assessment. I sent it to Carter, Lydia, our General Counsel Simon Foster, and our Board Liaison. I explicitly outlined Article 12, Section 7, Subsection D, attaching the full text. I detailed the client contract implications, even including a spreadsheet of clients with continuity requirements. I included a comprehensive risk assessment, projecting potential exposure. Carter responded within 90 minutes, "Thanks for the input. We'll take this under advisement." Simon, our General Counsel, sent a separate message, "Tinsley, I'll review with our outside counsel. Appreciate you flagging this." That was it. No follow-up meeting, no detailed review, no indication they grasped the magnitude of what I'd outlined. Just an acknowledgement and filing away. 3 weeks later, I received a calendar invitation, Strategic Workforce Planning Session. Executive Conference Room. All leadership. December 6th. I knew immediately what this meant. The choreography was too familiar. These aren't collaborative discussions, they're carefully scripted termination events, with witnesses to document proper procedure. The night before, I sat in our home office, reviewing my comprehensive documentation folder. Jacob came in around 10:30 p.m. with tea. "Still working?" he asked. "Preparing for tomorrow's meeting." He knew something big was happening. "Are they planning to terminate you?" he asked. "That appears to be the likely outcome." He sat down, his engineering mind already processing scenarios. "Tinsley, we'll manage financially. You'll find another position. Your reputation is exceptional." "I know we'll be fine," I said. "But this isn't about finding another position. This is about them understanding what they're actually eliminating." I showed him the contract language, Claire's exposure calculations, the client implications. He read silently, his expression shifting from concern to amazement. "They really didn't review any of this, did they?" he said finally. "The new leadership team, they weren't part of the original negotiations. Carter's been here less than 2 months. Lydia came from a completely different industry. They see numbers on a spreadsheet representing cost, not the systems that protect those numbers from regulatory catastrophe." "So, what happens tomorrow?" he asked. My answer was simple: tomorrow, they learn what expensive actually means. I arrived at 8:45 a.m. The executive conference room, with its floor-to-ceiling views of Lower Manhattan, was a beautiful setting for what was essentially a corporate execution. Lydia Vance sat at the head, professionally neutral. Carter Wells to her right, laptop connected. Simon Foster reviewing documents with unusual intensity. 3 Vanguard board observers, including the sharp-eyed Elizabeth Hartwell, whose questions had grown increasingly pointed in recent quarterly reviews. Our CFO, Wyatt Cooper, looked distinctly uncomfortable, adjusting his tie, avoiding eye contact. Carter stood. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending this important workforce optimization session. The first slide, Operational Excellence through Strategic Restructuring. Then, a departmental expense breakdown. Regulatory compliance, 31% of operational overhead, highlighted in bright red, with an arrow pointing directly to my position and compensation. Now, I want to be absolutely clear," Carter continued, his tone modulated for maximum reasonableness. "This discussion isn't about individual performance. Tinsley Drake has been a valued team member throughout her tenure. Has been, not is." The language was deliberate. "However, compliance technology has advanced. Automated platforms can now handle regulatory monitoring with 99.7% accuracy at a fraction of current personnel costs. Another slide appeared, Compliance Modernization Roadmap. Phase 3 showed legacy role transition with estimated annual savings of $740,000. No name, but everyone knew. Elizabeth Hartwell from Vanguard spoke, her voice measured. What's the transition timeline here? What risk mitigation protocols? Excellent questions, Carter replied smoothly. We're proposing a 90-day knowledge transfer to our newly hired compliance manager, with full transition to automated monitoring by March 1st. 90 days. Not the 240 days required by my contract. Simon Foster raised a hand slightly. Have we conducted a comprehensive review of the contractual implications of this restructuring? HR has confirmed that all employment agreements include standard at-will termination provisions, Carter said confidently. This is a legitimate business efficiency decision. Standard provisions. He clearly hadn't read Article 12, Section 7, subsection D. Or he had, and fundamentally misunderstood it. Any other questions before we move to implementation specifics? Carter asked, scanning the room with practiced confidence. I could have remained silent. Let them continue. Let them sign their papers and congratulate themselves on their decisive leadership. But sometimes, the most effective tactical response is the one nobody anticipates. I stood slowly, reached into my portfolio, and placed a sealed envelope on the table directly in front of Lydia Vance. I'd like to save everyone considerable time and legal expense, I said, my voice calm. The room went completely silent. Carter's confident expression flickered. Tinsley, Lydia said, attempting to maintain control, there's no need for theatrical gestures. We haven't even discussed the transition support package and severance arrangement yet. I removed my building access badge and security credentials, placing them on top of the envelope. The plastic hitting would make a sharp sound in the silent room. Inside that envelope, I said, looking directly at Lydia, is my resignation, effective immediately. Also included is a copy of Article 12, Section 7, subsection D of my employment agreement, along with a detailed analysis prepared by my attorney regarding contractual exposure and client contract implications. I believe your legal team will want to review this material very carefully, and very quickly. Simon Foster had already reached for the envelope. He opened it, scanned the first page, then flipped to the contract excerpt. I watched his face transform, eyes widening incrementally, jaw tightening, color draining slightly. What does it say? Lydia asked, her voice sharp now, the professional neutrality cracking. Simon looked at Carter, then at Elizabeth Hartwell, then back at the documents. It's a key person protection clause. If Tinsley's role is terminated or materially restructured without a 240-day transition period and formal board approval, it triggers immediate acceleration of all deferred compensation, invested equity, and performance bonuses accumulated over her entire tenure. The room went completely quiet, except for the subtle hum of the HVAC. How much acceleration are we discussing? Wyatt Cooper asked, his voice strained. Simon was still reading, his finger tracing lines of text with increasing concern. 14 years of deferred performance bonuses indexed to client retention and company valuation. Equity adjustments tied to the Vanguard acquisition terms. Plus, he paused, reading more carefully, penalty provisions if her departure causes client contract disruptions. Several major institutional clients have termination rights if senior compliance personnel change without proper notification and approval. Carter had gone visibly pale. That wasn't included in the HR summary documentation. HR doesn't review executive protection clauses, Simon said quietly. Those are negotiated directly during acquisitions and maintained by legal counsel. They're not part of standard employment documentation. I pushed my chair back. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute here. I wish everyone stability and success in the coming months. As I walked toward the door, I heard Lydia's voice, tight and controlled now. Simon, what's our total exposure here? Give me a preliminary number. I didn't wait for his answer. The door clicked softly behind me, a remarkably final sound. By the time I reached the parking garage, my phone was buzzing insistently. 6 missed calls from office numbers I recognized. I ignored them. There's a specific window after a decision like this, too early for consequences to materialize, too late for prevention. I sat in my Lexus for a few minutes, looking back at the glass and steel tower, housing 940 employees who had no idea what was about to unfold. I pulled out my personal phone and called Jacob. Hey. His voice was warm. I resigned, I said simply. Both. Are you okay? Yes. Better than okay, actually. Can you leave work early today? I think we should discuss what happens next before this becomes a media story. Tinsley, you're making me nervous. What's happening? Nothing to be nervous about. Things are about to become very complicated at Crest, and I want you to understand the complete picture before it reaches the business press. After we ended the call, I drove home through Manhattan traffic in unusual silence. No music, no podcasts. Just the anticipation of watching a carefully constructed system execute exactly as designed. Back in that conference room, I knew what was unfolding without being present. Legal teams don't panic visibly or dramatically, they panic methodically, with spreadsheets and liability assessments and urgent calls to outside counsel. Simon would be pulling contract files, calling Vanguard's legal team, running exposure calculations that worsened with each iteration. That afternoon, my former colleague, Aidan Brooks, texted from his personal phone, "Emergency legal meeting. All senior leadership." What the hell did you do? I texted back, "Read my contract. Article 12, Section 7, Subsection D." His reply, "Holy shit." By 6 p.m., the first client inquiry arrived, not to me, but to Crest's general compliance inbox. The New York State Common Retirement Fund, managing $268 billion, asking a straightforward question: who is now certifying their quarterly regulatory filings under their master service agreement? There was no answer. Nobody else at Crest held the specific certifications required. My replacement would need at least 24 months of training, examination, and supervised experience to achieve comparable credentials, assuming they could even find someone with the right background. Another inquiry followed within an hour from the California State Teachers' Retirement System, asking if their contractual continuity provisions were still satisfied. Those provisions, buried in an 800-page master service agreement, referenced my specific position and certifications explicitly. At 9:03 p.m., Claire called. "Tinsley, I've been reviewing the situation. This Article 12 provision is executing exactly as written." "I know. Are you prepared for full enforcement? The exposure calculation is going to be substantial." I heard paper shuffling. Direct compensation acceleration, if triggered immediately, approximately $11.4 million. But that's before secondary cascade effects. Secondary effects? Client contract clauses. 7 of your largest institutional clients have termination rights if you leave without proper transition protocols. I'm seeing potential exposure in the hundreds of millions if this cascades through their entire client portfolio. Inside Crest, Carter was likely arguing that I had resigned voluntarily, that nothing had technically been terminated, that contract language could be interpreted flexibly. But contracts don't interpret themselves based on desired outcomes. They execute based on clear, unambiguous triggers, written precisely to prevent flexible interpretation. The clause wasn't punitive, it was protective, a safeguard against losing concentrated institutional knowledge. By midnight Friday, their finance team had run initial exposure scenarios. By Monday morning, they ran them again with expanded parameters. Each iteration revealed additional contractual linkages and cascade effects nobody had anticipated. My role wasn't operationally isolated, it was referenced directly or indirectly in continuity provisions across multiple high-value client agreements. These agreements had cross-default language. Disruption in one area created leverage in others. New York State Common Retirement Fund, for example, had a clause allowing asset withdrawal without penalty if their designated compliance contact was removed without 240 days' notice and board approval. Their account generated $185 million annually. California's state teachers' retirement system had similar language. Their exposure, $290 million annually. When you build systems to survive regulatory stress, those same systems become unforgiving when stress is introduced artificially by careless management. Friday afternoon, Lydia called from her personal cell. "Tinsley, we need to talk. This situation has escalated significantly." "I'm listening." Legal counsel is projecting total exposure that could exceed 9 figures if institutional clients start exercising termination rights. "This goes far beyond your individual compensation." "That seems like a reasonable projection," I said, "based on the contractual architecture." A long pause. "Is there any way to resolve this? Some kind of arrangement that satisfies the contractual requirements while minimizing disruption?" I was sitting in our living room, watching afternoon light filter through the windows overlooking our quiet Brooklyn street. Normal Friday afternoon in our neighborhood, while downtown Manhattan was probably in complete crisis mode. "Lydia," I said, "the contract language is extremely specific. Once triggered, it resolves through either full execution of all provisions or through litigation. There's no middle ground or negotiated compromise built into the structure." "What would full execution look like?" "Complete acceleration of all deferred compensation, plus applicable penalties, plus whatever client attrition occurs naturally from the disruption. And that assumes you can prevent the worst cascade scenarios and litigation. Litigation would freeze all affected client accounts, trigger additional default clauses, and likely involve SEC oversight. You'd also be litigating against me while trying to reassure institutional clients that your compliance infrastructure is stable. That's not a sustainable position." Another long pause. "Tinsley, how did we miss this? How did this not come up in our planning process?" "You didn't miss it, Lydia," I said. "You were warned explicitly, in writing, 3 weeks ago. You chose not to take it seriously." After I ended the call, Jacob came in. "That was Lydia." "Yes." "What did she want?" "To know if there's a way out that doesn't involve full contractual execution." "Is there?" I showed him the contract language again, Claire's updated exposure calculations. "Only one way out. Pay everything that's contractually owed, and hope institutional clients don't exercise their termination rights anyway." By Monday morning, their finance team had finalized preliminary exposure calculations. $1.5 billion in combined projected exposure. Not theoretical anymore. This represented a material recalculation of Crest Global Solutions' entire enterprise value. The board convened an emergency session Monday evening. I wasn't invited, obviously, but I could envision it clearly: closed conference room, catered dinner no one touched. The slow, uncomfortable realization settling over everyone that this wasn't a negotiation. It was a contractual execution they had triggered themselves. Elizabeth Hartwell from Vanguard would have asked the obvious question: how did we miss this during our operational oversight? The answer was straightforward: they hadn't missed it during the original acquisition. They'd built these protections specifically because they understood the risk. But new management had ignored that institutional memory. Carter reportedly argued until his voice failed that the clause was excessive, unintentional, that nobody could have reasonably predicted this magnitude. But Simon didn't argue back. He didn't need to. Contracts don't care about intention or reasonableness. They care about execution. The call came Wednesday evening. William Ashford, Vanguard's managing partner, a man whose name rarely appeared in public but whose decisions shaped billions in private equity investments. Tinsley, thank you for taking my call. His voice was measured, professional, devoid of emotion. I've been thoroughly briefed on the situation. The board recognizes there were substantial failures in how this restructuring was handled. Substantial failures, corporate euphemism for catastrophic miscalculation. We'd like to resolve this efficiently, he continued, in a manner that reflects your contributions appropriately and minimizes disruption to our clients and investors. My attorney has outlined the terms required for contractual resolution, I said calmly. Yes, we've reviewed them carefully. One question: if we execute full settlement within the contractual parameters, does the client cascade stop, or do we face additional defections regardless? Fair question, I said. If executed within the contractual window and properly communicated to affected clients with appropriate reassurances, yes, all continuity provisions can be satisfied. You'll need to hire replacement expertise quickly and implement proper transition protocols, but the contractual triggers can be resolved. We'll proceed then. The next 72 hours moved faster than the previous month combined. Credit facilities were adjusted. Internal communications were carefully drafted, reviewed by 3 separate law firms. External announcements were prepared for clients and regulators. Carter Wells's name stopped appearing on company-wide communications. He wasn't terminated, that would create additional exposure. Instead, he was transitioned to an advisory role supporting special strategic projects. Corporate purgatory. When the final settlement paperwork was executed Friday morning, Claire sent a text, executed in full. Client cascade contained. Congratulations on the outcome. I was sitting in our kitchen, drinking coffee and reading the New York Times business section. Jacob had already left for a project site. Logan was still asleep upstairs, home for winter break. A normal Friday morning in Brooklyn while downtown Manhattan was processing an $11.4 million settlement to avoid a $1.5 billion catastrophe. Victory isn't loud or dramatic when it's earned through careful preparation and strategic patience. There's no celebration, just quiet satisfaction that meticulous planning met opportunity, exactly as designed. Within 10 days, discreet messages started arriving through my professional network. Not from recruiters, but from managing partners, chief investment officers, board chairs, people who understood exactly what had happened without detailed explanations. They didn't ask why I'd left Crest. They asked what I could build for them. One conversation stood out: Lauren Montgomery, founding partner at Sovereign Risk Advisors in Boston. We spoke for nearly 3 hours. Tinsley, we don't need you to recreate what you did at Crest, she said. We need you to design what comes next. Regulatory complexity is accelerating faster than most firms can adapt. We want to be ahead of that curve. What kind of organizational structure are you envisioning? Senior partner, equity stake, complete autonomy to build your team and client relationships. And Tinsley, she paused meaningfully, your compensation package gets designed by you, reviewed by our partnership committee, but never questioned by someone who thinks institutional knowledge is a line item to eliminate. That was sufficient. That represented understanding. For weeks later, Jacob and I flew to Boston for the contract signing. Sovereign Risk Advisors occupied 4 floors overlooking Boston Harbor. Understated elegance, where serious people made consequential decisions. During the signing, Lauren introduced me to their anchor client, the Massachusetts Pension Reserve's Investment Management Board. Their chief investment officer, Levi Coleman, shook my hand with genuine warmth. We've been following your situation at Crest quite closely, he said. Impressive contract architecture and execution. We're looking forward to working with someone who understands that regulatory compliance isn't a software subscription. It's institutional knowledge that requires decades to develop properly. 6 months later, sitting in my new corner office overlooking Boston Harbor, I got a call from Aidan Brooks. He'd left Crest 3 months after me, along with 6 other senior managers who'd recognized the organizational trajectory. Tinsley, thought you should know. Crest just lost the New York State Common Retirement Fund account. They cited concerns about compliance infrastructure continuity in their termination letter. I wasn't surprised. Once institutional confidence fractures, it propagates like cracks spreading across glass under pressure. "What's Carter doing?" I asked. Last I heard, he took a position at a boutique consulting firm in Austin, Operational Strategy Consulting. Apparently, he's become extraordinarily thorough about reviewing employment contracts before recommending any personnel restructuring. We both laughed. Sometimes the most expensive lessons create the most lasting behavioral changes. That evening, I called Logan at Cornell. He was in his final semester of sophomore year. "Mom, my finance professor keeps mentioning that article in the Wall Street Journal about you and Crest. People in my study group keep asking if you're like, wealthy now or something." "We are financially secure, sweetheart. Your tuition is covered completely. Your father doesn't have to worry about finances. That's what matters most." "But are you happy?" he asked. I mean, genuinely happy with how everything turned out. I looked out my office window at Boston Harbor, then at the framed photograph on my desk, Jacob, Logan, and our rescue dog, Cooper, in our Brooklyn backyard last summer. All of us laughing at something now forgotten. "Yes," I said. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Doing work that matters, with people who understand what that actually means." These days, when I walk into client meetings, nobody questions how much I cost. They ask how much risk I can identify and mitigate. They ask what I see developing that they don't. They ask for my professional analysis and then actually implement the recommendations. That difference matters more than $11.4 million in accelerated compensation ever could. Because ultimately, this was never primarily about the money. It was never about revenge or vindication or proving a point. It was about being valued for who you are, respected for what you know, and compensated appropriately for what you protect. Sometimes you have to walk away from everything you've built over 14 years to discover what you're genuinely worth. And sometimes, if you've prepared carefully enough and documented thoroughly enough, the system protects itself through mechanisms designed precisely for that purpose. Carter Wells taught me an important lesson that morning in the conference room, though not the lesson he intended. He taught me that people who view you as a line item to eliminate are exactly the people you should never work for in the first place. And when you finally find people who see you as the solution instead of the problem, people who understand that institutional knowledge can't be replaced with software subscriptions, that's when you know you've made the right decision. 18 months after my departure, Crest Global Solutions announced a merger. The transaction valued Crest substantially less than pre-merger projections, with analysts citing client attrition in key institutional segments and regulatory compliance infrastructure concerns as contributing factors to the valuation discount. Carter Wells' LinkedIn profile now lists his tenure at Crest as lasting exactly 9 months. Lydia Vance departed 6 months after the merger, taking a position at a mid-sized technology company far removed from financial services. Simon Foster, the general counsel who'd opened my resignation envelope that December morning, reached out privately last month. We met for coffee. "I wanted to apologize," he said, stirring his espresso. "I received your memo. I read it. And I filed it away, thinking it was procedural noise rather than an actual warning. That was negligent on my part. Did you learn from it?" I asked. "I now personally review every executive protection clause in our employment agreements," he said. "And when someone with institutional knowledge sends a warning memo, I schedule an immediate meeting to discuss implications, rather than filing it away." Something valuable came from the experience, then. Sovereign Risk Advisors has grown by 40% since I joined. We've added 12 institutional clients, including 3 of the largest public pension funds in North America. Our compliance architecture is now considered the industry standard. I've even been invited to speak at regulatory conferences about building sustainable institutional knowledge frameworks. Jacob jokes that I should write a book about corporate contract negotiation, but I prefer keeping these lessons within professional circles, where they'll be understood and appreciated properly. Last week, a young compliance analyst at one of our clients asked me for career advice. She was 26, smart, ambitious, worried about being viewed as just a compliance person rather than someone contributing to business growth. "Let me tell you something important," I said. "The people who don't value what you do will never understand it until it's gone. Your job isn't to convince them. Your job is to build something so structurally sound that its absence becomes immediately catastrophic. And then, make sure your contract reflects that reality." She looked uncertain. "Isn't that adversarial?" "It's protective," I said, "for you, and for them. The right people will never trigger those protections because they understand the value. The wrong people need those protections to prevent their own worst decisions. Good contracts don't create adversarial relationships, they create clarity. They force organizations to confront the actual value of institutional knowledge before making careless decisions. They protect both parties from circumstances where emotion or efficiency metrics override strategic judgment. I built my career on being someone organizations couldn't afford to lose carelessly. Not through politics, but through developing expertise that was genuinely irreplaceable within reasonable timeframes. When Carter Wells stood in that conference room, pointing at my compensation as if it represented waste rather than value, he wasn't seeing a person or a system or institutional knowledge. He was seeing a number that looked large in isolation, without understanding what that number protected. His mistake cost Crest $1.5 billion in projected exposure and actual losses. My preparation ensured I walked away with exactly what I'd earned and exactly what I deserved. And perhaps most importantly, it taught me that the best professional revenge isn't vindictive or emotional. It's contractual, documented, and entirely self-executing. So, tell me, have you ever been in a situation where your value was completely overlooked, only for people to realize their mistake when it was too late? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below.